Mac is not here tonight. He's in Dallas. There is a private school administrator seminar in Dallas, and he went there this evening. A couple of weeks ago, he asked me to teach this class, and it was a nice sunny day one Wednesday a couple of weeks ago, and I'm out cutting the grass. I took a break and sat underneath my tree and looked out over the pond. I'm thinking about the lessons I'm going to teach in Romania when I get there in August. Last year I taught the book of Joshua, and Joshua was a great leader. They took the land of Canaan. Now Judges is a different story. I came across this verse in Judges as I'm preparing my lesson. Judges chapter 2 and verse 10. After that whole generation had been gathered to their fathers, another generation grew up, who knew neither the Lord nor what He had done for Israel. That's one of the saddest verses in the Old Testament. You kind of know what's coming next in the book of Judges. They're going to lose everything Joshua has gained. We cannot forget that we need to teach again the next generation as we have been taught. Moses wrote in Deuteronomy chapter 4 verse 9, and I love this verse, "Only be careful and watch yourselves closely, so that you do not forget the things your eyes have seen, or let them fade from your heart as long as you live. Teach them to your children and to their children after them." Some of us have heard and studied long ago the issues that come around once and again. In the last few years, some of our churches have gone the way of instrumental music. So tonight I'd like to take a break from the Gospels and talk about instrumental music. It's a good study, the Gospels. There are 5,500 manuscripts of the Gospels. Most of them are fragments, some of them are complete books. 2/3 of all the manuscripts in the New Testament are the Gospels. We need to concentrate on the Gospels. It's an excellent study. But tonight I want to talk about a subject that is dividing the church. It's one of the few subjects that ends up dividing the church. The history of instrumental music in the churches of Christ is a history of division. We need to also remember that God is not going to judge us. Christ is going to judge us. John chapter 5 verse 22. "Moreover, the Father judges no one, but has entrusted all judgment to the Son, that all may honor the Son just as they honor the Father." Acts 17:31. "For He has set a day when He will judge the world with justice by the man He has appointed. He has given proof of this to everyone by raising Him from the dead." So I do not want to stand before Jesus in judgment and I have to explain to Him why I taught a false doctrine that ended up dividing the church for which He died. No one ever was all man and all God before. Jesus is the only individual in all history that ever had that position. And He is the perfect one to judge us. In John chapter 17, we have the famous prayer of Jesus for the unity of His disciples. In that prayer, He mentions His disciples 45 times in 26 verses. Unity is much more important than any instrument, no matter what the rationale. Of all the teachers that we had at the graduate school, probably the best to study the subject of instrumental music are Jack Lewis, Everett Ferguson, and Earl West. Jack Lewis and Everett Ferguson graduated with their doctorates from Harvard, and Earl West was a renowned scholar of Old Testament or of Restoration history. He wrote a 5-volume set. Together they wrote an excellent book entitled The Instrumental Music Issue. In one section of the book, they give several examples of division in the church caused by the instrument. One example. The instrument likewise made its entry into the church at St. Louis in 1869 amid deep resentments. The Vine Street Church of Christ, needing a better building, purchased one from the Episcopal Church at 17th and Olive Streets. Well furnished, it possessed carpeted floors, cushioned seats, and a $3,000 organ built into the brick wall in the organ loft. There was a lot of money in 1869. Bitter feelings soon developed as members argued what to do with the instrument. Opposition to its use was led by Dr. Hiram Christopher, a brother-in-law to J.W. McGarvey, and a former professor at Bethany College. So much ill will followed that the church selected a panel of 5 men, led by Isaac Errett, editor of the Christian Standard, to arbitrate. Christian Standard was a paper that went out of print. It was just like the Firm Foundation of the Gospel Advocate. The committee advised, for the sake of peace, that the instrument not be used. Those who favored the instrument left the church, met in a rented hall, and finally established the Central Christian Church. One more example. J.D. Tant was a unique and talented man. He held the first evangelistic meeting at Georgetown, Texas in 1881 in an old mill at the foot of a bridge across the Gabriel River. E. Hansbrough and a brother House were with him. A congregation was founded which later erected a building in the north part of town with 78 members. When Tant returned the next year for his second meeting, the church had divided over the organ, and those using it met in the south part of town. The elders of the South Church came to hear him in his second meeting and asked him to preach for them, promising to set aside the instrument for his meeting. He agreed, but when it was announced at a service, a woman arose to explain that she had worked hard to get the organ in the church, and she would see every member of North Georgetown dead and in hell before she would agree to set the organ aside. She was not willing to give up her love of the organ to preserve the unity of the body of Christ. It's been said that a cappella music can be a roadblock or a hindrance to some who visit the Church of Christ services. I'm sorry that some feel that way, but the Lord never felt that way. The first thing we need to remember about worship, and you can't discuss instrumental music without discussing worship, is that it is for the Lord and not for us. We don't get to choose how to worship the Lord. The Israelites didn't get to choose how they worship the Lord. God gave Moses many commands on Mount Sinai, contained in the book of Leviticus and several other places, about worship. About the burnt offering, the grain offering, the fellowship offering, the sin offering, the guilt offering, laws about how the priests were to prepare the sacrifices, how the tabernacle was to be made and set up, about the Ark of the Covenant, the most holy place, the incense, the lampstand, the table of the presence, the altar, and the courtyard. And on we could go. There are 11 chapters in the book of Exodus, 1/4 of the book, that are devoted to the details of building the tabernacle and the color of threads to be used in the priest's garments, which was the center of Old Testament worship. God did not ask for their input because it was worship to Him. And we don't have regulations today for how we should build our buildings. The great central act of worship to the Lord in the church today is the Lord's Supper. Every instance of the Lord's Supper in the New Testament includes a form of the word Eucharisto, which means thanksgiving. The worship of God is us giving thanks to God for all that He has done for Israel. We are His instruments, 2 Timothy 2:21. And when we sing, when we give thanks in a song, we make music to Him on the instrument that He has made. And this brings glory and praise to Him through us. God is not praised by an instrument. The manufacturer and player are praised. Although we might be entertained by musical instruments, and I love instrumental music. I can give you a list of wonderful instrumental songs. Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert, Chopin, on, and some later day ones. I'm thinking of Andrew Ryu, who goes all over the world. Beautiful music. But God is not entertained by musical instruments. And by the way, we're not the only religious group that does not use an instrument. The Eastern Orthodox Church does not and has never used an instrument in worship. The Western Church, or the Catholic Church as it became known, first began using an instrument about the 6th century AD. Up until that time, instruments were not used by anyone, anywhere, that claimed to follow Christ. Now, sometimes a charge is made that the churches of Christ are not seeker sensitive, that we do not make our worship attractive to outsiders. What they are really saying is that we need to add the instrument to our worship to make our worship exciting. If we look back at the Old Testament, and here again it's an excellent example how the Old Testament is useful today, we can answer this question. Was God seeker sensitive in the Old Testament when He designed worship? God never thought that He needed to design worship to be attractive to outsiders. Exodus chapter 8, verse 25. Then Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, "Go sacrifice to your God here in the land." But Moses said, "That would not be right. The sacrifices we offer the Lord our God would be detestable to the Egyptians. And if we offer sacrifices that are detestable in their eyes, will they not stone us? We must take a 3-day journey into the desert to offer sacrifices to the Lord our God as He commands us." To Christians, the very fact that the Lord designed worship is the attractive part. The worship of God is sometimes seen by the world as boring, ignorant, outdated, uninspiring, and even offensive. God knows this. He also knows why worship should be as He designed it. And He also knows that unless the world changes, they will never know real worship. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, in her famous book on death and dying, made some very interesting statements. She said, "A lot of people know how to make a good living, but few people know how to live." The same thing can be said of worship. A lot of people think they know how to worship to God should be, but only a few know how to worship God. It's been said in 2 Chronicles that God commanded the use of instrumental music. 2 Chronicles chapter 29, verse 25. He, that is Hezekiah, stationed the Levites in the temple of the Lord with cymbals, harps, and lyres in the way prescribed by David, and Gad the king's seer, and Nathan the prophet. This was commanded by the Lord through His prophets. Now the setting of this verse is the purification of the temple after its defilement by King Ahaz, which was Hezekiah's father. It was a celebration of the reestablishment of the original service of the temple. 2 Chronicles 29:35. The Lord's command was not the introduction of musical instruments in worship, but instructions to the Levites who played the instruments of David in the temple. Nowhere in the law of Moses did God command musical instruments in worship. But in this verse, God, through David and the prophets Gad and Nathan, gives Hezekiah divine permission to use instruments in the purification service. Now we need to read this verse also in the context. The next two verses. Verse 26. So the Levites stood ready with David's instruments, and the priests with their trumpets. Hezekiah gave the order to sacrifice the burnt offering on the altar. As the offering began, singing to the Lord began also, accompanied by trumpets and the instruments of David, king of Israel. And there are at least 10 other references to David's instruments in the Old Testament. So you can see why almost all scholars believe David was the one who introduced instruments in worship with the approval of the Lord. Now let's look at instruments in the book of Revelation. Some people get confused and say, well, we have instruments in heaven. You can see that in Revelation. Let's take a closer look. In the Greek Bible, the Septuagint, not the Septuagint, the Septuagint, the title is Apocalypse, which means hidden or symbolic. Lots of symbolism in Revelation. The appearance of instruments in heaven in the Apocalypse is only a symbolic way of showing praise to God and is no support for their use in New Testament worship. There are no physical objects in heaven anyway. Do you really think the streets are made of gold or the gates to the city made from one pearl? Revelation 21:21. The 12 gates were 12 pearls, each gate made of a single pearl. The great street of the city was of pure gold, like transparent glass. There's not going to be any physical instruments in heaven. God is not praised by instruments. He is praised by His people. That's why we read of singing in heaven 3 times. It's also been said that the argument against instrumental music in worship is an argument from silence, because the biblical writers nowhere say we should not use an instrument. But just the opposite is true. The argument for instrumental music in worship is an argument from silence. Of the 7,957 verses of the New Testament, there is not one reference that authorizes or even gives an example of any use of instrumental music in worship. Nowhere are we instructed to play. That addition came in the 6th century A.D. It used to be, when God spoke, light appeared. Nature obeys God. It's only people that have trouble. When God inspired the Apostle Paul to write "Sing," that ends the discussion. When God inspired Luke to write Acts 20 and verse 7 about worshiping on the first day of the week, that ends the discussion of any other day. All major translations have first day of the week. In the Greek, it literally says first day of the Sabbath week. The Sabbath was always the 7th day. The week that contains the Sabbath was the Sabbath week. And so the first day of the Sabbath week was the first day of the week. And it's interesting to notice that there are many ancient church buildings that have an octagonally shaped baptistry. This was supposed to be symbolic of the 8th day, or the first day of the week, when Christians worshiped. They worshiped on the 8th day, play on words, and had an 8-sided baptistry to commemorate the first day of the week when they worship, because you can't make a one-sided baptistry. Now, to say 2 times in Colossians 3:16 and Ephesians 5:19 that we should sing is not silence. I was in the Air Force during the end of the Vietnam War, and when the commander tells you to line up, he doesn't have to tell you all the ways not to line up. You know that if you don't line up like you're supposed to line up, you're going to be in the brig. When the Apostle Paul gives qualifications for men who want to be elders, he does not need to say that women are not included. But there's much more to the story. There are at least 300 Christians from the first few centuries that have left us writings. They tell about what they did in worship. If Brother Allison lived in the 2nd century, and he left us letters describing what Christians did in their worship, we would know exactly what happened. You don't have to be inspired to tell the truth. The early Christian writers, even though they were not inspired, told us the truth about their worship. None of them, not even one of them, say they ever used musical instruments in worship. 300 writers over 500 years, that is not silence. Let's look at what they wrote. And these are in the book by Ferguson, West, and Lewis. Ignatius of Antioch, he was a Christian in the 2nd century. Now all of you together become a choir, and receiving the keynote from God, in unison you may sing with one voice through Jesus Christ to the Father. Justin Martyr, Christian in the 2nd century, send up to him honors and hymns for our creation. Niceta lived in the 4th century. He wrote, the corporal institutions have been rejected, like circumcision, the Sabbath, sacrifices, discriminations in foods, so too the trumpets, harps, cymbals, and timbrels. Hippolytus, who lived in the 3rd century, says, proper day in the house of God when all are praying there and singing to God. Eusebius lived in the 4th century. Throughout the world, he says, in cities, in villages, and in the country, in all the churches of God, the people of Christ, who have been chosen out of all nations, send up, not to the native gods, nor to demons, but to the one God spoken of by the prophets, hymns and psalms with a loud voice, so that the sound of those singing can be heard by those standing outside. And there's Clement of Alexandria in the 3rd century. There's also a Clement of Rome. The Clement of Alexandria in Egypt was highly critical of instruments and dancing in worship. He says, these are his words, and outside they foolishly amuse themselves with impious playing and amatory quavering, occupied with pipe playing and dancing and intoxication, all kinds of trash. And there are many other examples in Ferguson's book. Some early Christian writers associated the use of musical instruments with pagan immorality. And they recommended that instruments not be used even at home when singing church songs. Well, that's their opinion, but it shows how unlikely it would have been for instruments to be used in Christian worship to God. So where did these early Christians get their ideas about a cappella music in worship? From the apostles. Some of them knew the apostles personally. Some of them knew people or had friends that knew the apostles personally. Ferguson writes about worship, worship is what a person offers to God. What human beings offer to God in the assembly of the church should be expressive of the highest nature in the human relationship with God. The assembly, among other things, is a service of praise. Christians offer their highest and best to God. The important thing in Christian worship is not our uplift, what pleases our senses, or what we find aesthetically satisfying. Instrumental music may put one in a certain mood, may stir his heart, may stimulate high sentiments, but one's feelings are not his worship. Instrumental music performed by someone else cannot be something I offer to God. The assembly of the church exemplifies the spiritual relationship with God and the spiritual nature of all worship. As a mechanical act, producing instrumental music is distinct from the offering of spiritual worship. The voice is much more a matter of oneself than any other gift of praise can ever be. In the conclusion to his book, Ferguson writes that the early Christians thought that instrumental music in comparison to vocal music was like incense in comparison to prayer. The incense in the most holy place in the temple represented the prayers of God's people. You have the most holy place with the Ark of the Covenant, the altar of incense, the holy place, the table to show bread, and the lampstand. But only in the most holy place with the Ark of the Covenant is the altar of incense. Psalms 141. May my prayer be set before you like incense. Revelation chapter 8 verse 3. Another angel who had gotten a golden censer came and stood at the altar. He was given much incense to offer with the prayers of all the saints on the golden altar before the throne. The smoke of the incense, together with the prayers of the saints, went up before God from the angel's hand. One thing that should impress us about that verse is the importance of prayer. It's the only thing in the tabernacle that rose up before the presence of God. And that's what the altar, the Ark of the Covenant signified, was the presence of God. That's how close our prayers are to God, in the holiest of holies. Hebrews chapter 9, verse 3. Behind the second curtain was a room called the Most Holy Place, which had the golden altar of incense and the gold-covered Ark of the Covenant. Had seraphim on the top, overlaid in gold. They pounded the gold out very thin and covered these things. A lot of work went into making the Ark of the Covenant. It was set in the most holy place behind a curtain. People didn't see it. You weren't supposed to see it. It was a symbol of God's presence, but you weren't supposed to see it. When they moved the tabernacle, they had to cover it up before they could carry it out. The ark symbolized God's presence. In Old Testament worship, the incense represented the prayers of God's people. In New Testament worship, Christians can pray without incense to God. In Old Testament worship, the instruments accompanied the singing. In New Testament worship, Christians can sing without instruments to God. The early Christians thought that instrumental music was a falling back to a lower level of Old Testament religious expression. And they were right. Now let's summarize what we've been saying, and then let's look at a few theological parallels. First, musical instruments were not used in the church or in any form of Christian worship until at least the 6th century A.D. Number two, 300 early Christian writers from the first 5 centuries tell us that they did not use an instrument in worship. Number three, the Apostle Paul told us twice that we should sing to the Lord in the assembly. Number four, the introduction of musical instruments in the Lord's church has always been divisive. Number five, we are God's instruments, and our songs bring praise and glory to Him. Number six, we cannot add instruments to the worship of the church because we're not inspired to do so. Number seven, God allowed instruments in Old Testament worship, but not in New Testament worship. Number eight, God is not praised by an instrument because worship to God is spiritual. Now let's look at a few theological parallels and try to get an idea of what the difference is between Old Testament worship and New Testament worship. A lot of things were changed. 1,500 years of the law of Moses was a lot for the Jews to deal with when Jesus came along and taught them more perfectly the way of God. First there was the temple. They had a physical temple. Solomon built the temple. David collected materials for 15 years, took Solomon 7 years to build it. It was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. We don't have a physical temple. We are God's temple. 1 Corinthians 3:16. They had a physical city, Jerusalem. Even Abraham looked forward to a heavenly city. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 10. They had the Ark of the Covenant, a physical representation of God's presence. Where's God's presence today? Matthew 1:23, Jesus was born of a virgin, and they should call His name Emmanuel, which means God with us. Ephesians 2:22, in Him you are being built together to become a dwelling in which God lives by His Spirit. His presence is in the church. They had physical priests, actual human priests. We are God's priests. 1 Peter 2:9, we are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that we may declare the praises of Him who called us out of darkness into His wonderful light. And they had incense in the tabernacle, in the temple. We have prayers, Revelation chapter 5, verse 8. And they had musical instruments. we sing today, speaking to one another in psalms, hymns, and songs from the Spirit. Sing and make music from your heart to the Lord. They had the law of Moses written on tables of stone, which were kept in the Ark of the Covenant, along with the rod of Aaron that budded, and of the manna. 2 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 3, you show that you are a letter from Christ, the result of our ministry, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of human hearts. God no longer needs tablets of stone. He has our hearts. Then there was the Passover meal, very important, one of the 3 great annual feasts. What does it represent in a new worship, in the new covenant? The Lord's Supper. Matthew chapter 26, verse 29. Jesus said, I will not drink from this fruit of the vine from now on until the day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. And they had a high priest. We don't have a high priest anymore. We have Christ as our high priest, no longer a human high priest. They had the law of Moses. We have the promises of Christ. Hebrews chapter 8, verse 6. But in fact, the ministry Jesus has received is as superior to theirs as the covenant of which he is mediator is superior to the old one, since the new covenant is established on better promises. They were looking forward to the new covenant that would make them and us perfect, with remission of sins from a perfect sacrifice. And then the last one, which I really like. There was Mount Sinai. It's not mentioned in Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 18. You have not come to a mountain that can be touched and that is burning with fire, to darkness, gloom, and storm. Every time God descended on Mount Sinai, there was a great storm, and it scared the people. They thought Mount Sinai probably was a mountain that just rose up out of the desert suddenly so you could come up and touch it. We have not come to a mountain that can be touched. Verse 22, but you have come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. You have come to thousands and thousands of angels in joyful assembly, to the church of the newborn, whose names are written in heaven. You have come to God, the judge of all, to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. They could not approach God in the Old Testament. They could not even see the Ark of the Covenant. But by Jesus, we can approach near to God. His presence was hidden in the temple. We have the grace that the prophets predicted would come in the last days. The instrument only stands between us and God and represents Old Testament shadows of New Testament realities. I want to end with a scripture. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 15. Through Jesus, therefore, let us continually offer to God a sacrifice of praise, the fruit of lips that confess His name.